Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Jeff Dalrymple with the Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention, and you've joined us for our episode of Meet the Experts. With me today is Beth Broom. Beth is a dear, dear friend, a mutual friend of Eliza Huey that I met a couple of years ago, and she's a licensed Christian counselor in the DFW area. She is the executive director of Christian Trauma Healing Network, and we're absolutely thrilled to have her on. We're going to hear a little bit about her first personally, and then we're going to jump into the big question, which is how do we as ministry leaders find a good Christian counselor? You know, this topic comes to us because at the Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention, our mission is to help create safe places for kids to hear the gospel and to grow in discipleship. We're really focused on preventing sexual abuse from taking place. But because we live in this Genesis 3 world, this broken, sinful world that we live in, Christian leaders are asking us on a regular basis, where do I go to find a good Christian counselor? What criteria do I look at when finding a Christian counselor, especially related to some of these more specialized topics like abuse, trauma, and sexual abuse and all the rest? And so I could not think of anyone better to come in and help us address this important topic than Beth Broom. Well, I hope along the way you'll tap into some of the resources that we have at the ECAP website. That's ecap.net. You're going to learn more about Beth and her ministry and some resources towards the end of her presentation. But just want to say welcome, greetings from Florida. We're recording this on a chilly day, but that's very, very subjective, as some of my live audience knows. So thanks for being with us. Again, ECAP is a Christian ministry, a national association of Christian ministries committed to child and youth protection. And we do that through established standards, compliance, which results in an independent and evidence-based accreditation program. And that seal represents peace of mind for parents, confidence for leaders, and even deterrence for predators, that you can go and do the Christian ministry that you're called to do because you have reasonable measures in place. Well, Beth, thank you so much for being with us on this episode of Meet the Experts. Would you just take a few moments to share who you are, what you do, and how did you come into the Christian counseling space?
Thanks, Jeff. Well, the first two questions are easier and quicker. Coming into the Christian counseling space is a whole story. I'll try to be as brief as possible, but I am a licensed professional counselor, also a biblical counselor in the state of Texas, and I have been doing that. I've been a licensed professional counselor for many years. Began a private counseling practice in 2020 when COVID hit. Had no plans to do that, but decided to do that in light of everybody being home and going virtual for counseling. And I have enjoyed so much being able to do the private counseling work with folks. But I am a church girl at heart, was on staff at my church for 13 years. I'm still a member of that church, the Village Church Denton, and love church-based ministry. Think that obviously the grandest and most important way that we can love and serve the world is through the church. And so have been very involved in lay counseling ministry at our church, very involved in volunteer type ministries related to care and recovery, and I love it. And so I've used my license in the ministry context a lot, and I've used ministry context to help me in my licensed practice. And so I love doing that work. I'm also the executive director of Christian Trauma Healing Network, and I can talk about that a little bit more at the end. But we are an equipping ministry that helps pastors, ministry leaders, counselors, lay counselors to grow in how to care for people who've been traumatized from a Christ-centered perspective. And we found years ago that there were not a lot of resources out there that were practical for folks who wanted to do this kind of ministry, but maybe felt ill-equipped because it is very hard. So that is kind of the bent of what Christian Trauma Healing Network does. And I got into counseling out of my own story, my own trauma and struggle, and the desire to help others as the Lord just started bringing people my way in my early 20s, of people who were hurting. And I had no idea how to care for them, but I knew I wanted to. And turns out that the very basic things that I was doing when I was 19 and 20 years old are the still the most important things that that we can do as counselors and as friends and mentors and disciplers, and that is to be present with people, to pray with them, to grieve with them, and to seek to point them towards the Lord and towards the Lord's people who are who will be able to resource them and care for them. So that's part of what I'm going to talk about related to how to find a good counselor. So I'm excited about this topic. It'll be great. And yeah, I'm eager to get started.
Well, thank you, Beth. Really appreciate you. Be sure to say hello to your pastor, Bo Hughes, there at Village Denton, a mutual connection. And I'll never forget coming on to the podcast that you have with Eliza Huey, Counsel for Life. It's been maybe a couple of years now, but so thankful for you and your ministry and the resources that you and your team produce. So we'll just jump right in. So that's the question for you today. On Meet the Experts, we could not, again, think of anyone better to answer this question. How to find a good Christian counselor, what criteria do we think about, and then jumping into even the specialization of sexual abuse and other types of specialty items that are related to counseling. So, well, I think you got a screen share there, Beth, but we'll
Yep.
turn it over to you. And we'll ask folks here with our live audience to go ahead and submit questions along the way for our Q&A time at the end. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I want to begin by saying that finding the right counselor it can be a very difficult process, and it does require patience and prayer. And the other thing that's tough about it is that it's incredibly subjective. So the perfect counselor for you might be a terrible fit for me. So there are some personality things and some like relational connection kinds of dynamic things that really do matter, that as we're thinking about selecting a counselor. But what I want to give you today is some really basic things that are kind of no-brainers in my mind, things that you really need to look for, questions you'll want to ask based on what your need is. So I'm going to keep it pretty broad, but I will make sure and get specific as we go related to topics like needing a specialization for yourself or for a child or for someone that you know who has experienced abuse, because again, that is a specialization that really does need a certain set of eyes and ears looking at it from the counselor's perspective. So we'll go ahead and get started. I want to begin with kind of what would motivate you to look for a counselor. Most of my clients, when they start with me, the first thing I say is, man, you took a really brave step to come for the very first time, because you might have known you needed a counselor or wanted a counselor for a really long time, but actually doing it is another thing entirely. It takes a lot of courage to actually put yourself out there and in vulnerability seek out help and care related to things that are really deep and sensitive in your life. And so the willingness to do that is important. And so if you're at that space, I'm going to encourage you to make the move and try to move in that direction while motivation is still high, because it can definitely wane, especially as the ebbs and flows of life and things might get busy or simpler or easier. And then you think, maybe I don't need a counselor. But if you think that you might, it's important to at least consider what's going on inside or what's going on relationally that would lead you to want to seek out a counselor. So I'm just going to give you some examples. There may be a wound or a loss that you've experienced that is affecting your ability to function in daily life. So I always tell folks, if your daily functioning is decreased because of something hard that you're experiencing, seek out some extra help, even if it's not a formal counseling type of situation. You do want to have extra support if your ability to function in your daily life decreases. So you might need healing from a loss that you've experienced or a wound that's deep and kind of resurfacing, maybe something from a long time ago, but now you're finally in a space where you can sense that you need to deal with it. You might be seeking to overcome some sort of addiction or negative pattern of behavior. There might be something happening that you just can't seem to get a handle on that thing. You can't seem to stop, or you can't seem to be motivated to start moving in a healthy, positive direction. And so you just need somebody to help give you some structure as you're thinking about moving forward in new patterns of behavior. You might be experiencing relational conflict. That is very, very common. And often we don't know what to do. We even read the scriptures and we think, how do I apply this to what I'm experiencing in my relationships? So you may need a marriage counselor, or you may need an individual counselor to help you think about your marriage or your parenting or your friendships, that sort of thing. That's a very common reason to go to counseling. You might also be struggling with a lot of difficult emotions and thoughts. And once again, if those thoughts and emotions are hindering your ability to focus on your work, on your relationships, on your rest, if those things are being hindered, it's important to think about what you might need additionally. And a counselor could be a good resource for you in that sense. And I'm putting this lightly, but when we think about things like abuse and trauma, there's no way to not experience difficult emotions and thoughts. In fact, that's quite an understatement. Often those thoughts and emotions are so highly sensitized and so forward facing that they just negatively impact almost every, or if not every, area of life. And so when you experience those difficulties, you're going to need some help. And it's not wrong or bad to need help. In fact, Galatians 6 says that we should bear one another's burdens, and that is one of the ways we fulfill the law of Christ. So you need others to help bear your burden. You need the body of Christ, but you might need someone also who specifically understands how to create a plan that will help you move forward in healing, in growth, in change, that sort of thing. You might also just need some positive coping strategies. You've got some stressors in life, you've got some hard things that are happening, and you just want to learn some new things that will help move you forward. So in that sense, some of it is discipleship, right? Like a leaning into what does it look like to follow the Lord and walk in obedience in the midst of struggle. But counselors are well equipped. Hopefully, they've gone to school and they've done a lot of practicing in order to prepare themselves to be able to give you some strategies that will help you to cope with life's difficulties. You may just want to thrive more than you're thriving. I mean, Jesus said he came that we would have life and have it to the full. And I don't know about you, but there have been seasons of life where I think, I don't even know what that means. The fullness of Christ, like to live in abundant life. What does that mean? So not having the motivation for that, or not having the ability to think strategically about how to move towards growth and thriving, could be a reason that you might want to seek out counseling. And so these are all things that could be happening in your life, and there's a spectrum, right? Some folks want to go to counseling and because they've got a hard relationship that's they want to be able to talk through with somebody, and that's one end of the spectrum, all the way to I cannot be in the presence of this person who's a part of my family because they've harmed me in such awful ways. Or I'm a pastor and I'm experiencing lots of struggle because of the things going on in my church family that are so toxic. Let's be honest, that stuff happens, right? And there's a spectrum all the way. And so wherever you are on that spectrum of need will help to determine the type of counselor that you need, maybe how often you need to go to counseling, how long you might expect it to take to do the process of counseling. And it's funny because when clients ask me, how long is this going to take? It's really hard to answer that question because it really does depend upon multiple factors. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go today. So what kind of counselor do you want? There are a lot of options. And I know that there are lots of places in the United States and across the world where there really you don't have access to a lot of counselors. But in my area where I happen to live, the DFW area, we're pretty saturated with counselors. So there are lots of choices. And if you have insurance, for example, you could go on your insurance's website and type in, that you're looking for a professional counselor or a therapist, and it'll give you dozens of names of people. So how do you find what you're looking for amidst the vast number of options that you have? So here's just some things to consider as you think about the type of counselor that you want. Do you want to have a counselor who functions in an overtly Christian way? Or would you rather have somebody who doesn't function in an overtly Christian way? When I say overtly Christian, what I mean is that if you have a Christian counselor, not just a counselor who happens to be a Christian, but if you have a Christian counselor, the assumption is that that counselor will actually bring elements of the faith into the counseling process. You'll be talking about your discipleship process with the Lord, your relationships in the church, your obedience to the Lord in the midst of sin struggles. You'll be talking about those things if you're doing overtly Christian counseling. You'll also be talking about suffering from a Christian worldview, right? The idea that God never designed suffering to happen in this world, but when sin entered the world, suffering began to happen. And then the Lord sent a rescuer, someone who would redeem and heal our suffering. And that's Jesus. That's the kind of thing that you will be reminded of and talking about as you work through the elements of your suffering, if you're working with a Christian counselor. If you're not working with a Christian counselor, you're not going to have those elements. And so I don't sense any shame or frustration with people who don't want to have an overtly Christian counseling experience. And part of the reason for that is that often for many people who are believers, Someone who's sat in a position of authority or leadership in their lives has used scripture or the things of God to coerce and push down and abuse. So they don't actually want that because it feels scary to them. So I've actually had full-time ministry leaders and missionaries and whatnot say to me, please don't do Christian counseling with me, at least not for a while, because the scriptures feel prickly to me. The things of God feel prickly to me right now because of the abuse I've experienced, because of the trauma I've experienced. So we move slowly. And I much prefer to do overtly Christian counseling, but I also want to be honoring and respectful to the clients that I work with based on where they are in their current state. Secondly, do you want a licensed counselor or a non-licensed counselor? Now, this is an area that a lot of people feel confused about. So if you are seeing a licensed counselor, a licensed professional counselor, a licensed clinical professional counselor, a licensed psychologist, anything that says that they're licensed means that there are state regulations and mandates on that counselor, a code of ethics that they have to follow, which is a good thing. But there are downsides, so to speak, in that if you are in the state of Texas and you find a licensed counselor that you really like who's in the state of Nebraska, you cannot see that counselor because that counselor is a Nebraska counselor if they are licensed. Now, there are some things happening that eventually I think there'll be some state lines being allowed to be crossed. That's coming in time. It's called the Counseling Compact, where states are sometimes able to share counselors between them. But right now, the way it works is if you want a licensed counselor, you will have to find someone who's within your state. And so just be aware of that. A lot of people are not. Now, there are non-licensed counselors. We would call them pastoral counselors or biblical counselors, and they aren't under the same kinds of mandates as licensed counselors. They're not mandated by the state in the same way. So then if you found somebody who was in a different state that you really wanted to see for counseling, if they're not licensed and they have the space for you, you could do a virtual counseling relationship with that person without violating state regulations. So just know that licensed, non-licensed, those are two different types of counseling. I will also say that licensed counselors are required to do a massive number of clinical practical hours before they become fully licensed. There are 3,000 hours in the state of Texas, at least 3,000 hours that we have to do before we are fully licensed. And that is to ensure that we actually have had a lot of experience before we receive our license. Whereas non-licensed counselors do not have a requirement that's mandated across state lines or whatever that requires them to do a certain number of practicum or internship type hours before they become fully ready to become counselors. So there are some who would leave master's degree with a degree in counseling, but they're not getting licensed and they might go straight into a job and begin counseling without having done all of that practical experience. So that doesn't mean that they don't know what they're doing. They may be wonderful and they actually could be better equipped than these licensed counselors, but just know that the experiential requirements are different for each. Do you want to have a male counselor or a female counselor? Does that matter to you? And I think that's an important thing to consider because especially depending on your history and if you've had, let's say you're a male and you've had experience with a female that was a coercive, controlling kind of situation, you may not be comfortable sitting with a female counselor and vice versa. So it's important that you think about that and consider it if it does matter to you. And then do you want someone who's connected to your community? Once again, I think this is an important question to ask for several reasons. So many counselors actually will be willing to have clients who are members of the same church that they are, and other counselors don't feel comfortable with that. Some counselors want to counsel people that live far enough away that they're not going to run into each other in the grocery store. Some counselors don't care about that. So do you want to have a counselor that actually has connection to the community that you're a part of, whether that's your church community or your city, that kind of thing? Do you want to be able to have some of that crossover in the counseling relationship, or would you rather have that completely disconnected from your community? So it's just an important thing to consider. Do you want to be virtual or do you want to be in person? So again, if you want to have in-person experience with your counselor, that's going to narrow the field of who you have to choose from, right? Because you're probably not going to want to drive an hour or more to go and see your counselor. So just considering that, and it's something to ask when you begin to talk with counselors, what do they offer? Do they offer virtual versus in-person sessions, so that you can get a gauge of what they offer before you begin to step into those situations. Do you want a specialist or a generalist? And I will say this, there are situations and there are struggles that people face that a generalist can easily handle. These, and again, there's a spectrum of severity, so just know that. But like, for example, anxiety, depression, relational conflict, adjustment to a new lifestyle or time of life, like somebody who's going off to college for the first time. These are all things that we study pretty frequently in grad school to become counselors. We're talking about these things a lot. We become very familiar with these types of issues that people face because they are the most common issues. So if those are the kinds of things that you're experiencing and they're not too severe in your life, a generalist might be a great fit for you. And often generalists cost less than a specialist would cost. And so if you sense that you could go with a generalist, you might be able to have a lesser cost in counseling. And it might be just great for you. Now, a specialist is going to be more designed in a particular area to focus on particular things. For example, I'm a trauma specialist. I have high certifications, multiple certifications in trauma care as a counselor, professional counselor. That is what I do. And so I tend to specialize, and people will come to me because they want to do trauma healing work from a Christian perspective. They want that very narrow speciality, and that is what I offer. And so it's not that I can't do other things, but I love doing that work, and that's kind of what I've made myself known for. And so people will come to me specifically for that. They know that because I have extra training in that arena, I'm going to be able to move the needle in a way forward, and I'm going to understand some things about their struggle that a generalist might not understand. So it's important to just know that these sort of specialities, the very difficult things that people might be facing, whether that's abuse, trauma, or personality disorders or severe, mental illness kinds of things. These are things that while they're touched upon in grad school for counselors, they're not focused on very much. So unless a person gets a special certification after they graduate from their master's degree, they might not know a whole lot about how to care for these very specific things. So it is important to consider that. And I also want to say that, there's a speciality in working with children or adolescents. And not everyone is designed to do that. And not every counselor is going to be good at working with children or have any training and experience working with children. So if you are seeking out a counselor for children, you're going to want to have somebody that really knows that well and has studied it and has some special certification and training in those areas. And then what level of experience do you want? Again, if you're okay with someone who's fairly new to the field, you might be able to have a lesser cost involved with counseling. But you may have something that you really want somebody who's well experienced, and that's what you're looking for. So you just kind of need to have in your mind, that's what I want, and that's what I'm going to ask for whenever I talk with a potential counselor. And then do you want to use your insurance? And so some counselors take insurance, some counselors do not. And that's an important component, obviously, financially. So you'll want to understand that and decide whether you're sort of willing to pay out of pocket for a certain thing that you really want, or, will they take your insurance? Maybe you'll get the best of both worlds. But there are a lot of really good counselors out there that don't take insurance anymore for good reason. The reasons that they have make sense. And so you may or may not be able to use your insurance for counseling, depending on the counselor that you choose. So here are some questions that would be really great for you to ask in a phone consultation. So let me just say this. I kind of feel I'm going to share my opinion for just a moment, take it or leave it. I feel a little skeptical of any counselor who won't do a free phone consultation with you before starting counseling. Just a 15 minutes or 20 minutes. I feel a little skeptical of that because in my opinion, I think, man, I don't want you to spend money until you sense that maybe this will be a good fit. It's really hard to do that over email. So it's better if we can have a phone consultation, and maybe you don't need that, but I'd at least offer it to you as a counselor to say, hey, I'd love for you to ask me some questions and for us to get to know each other a little bit before you sign on saying, yes, I'm going to come and pay you money to be my counselor. So it's important that you ask for that if you're willing. I think it's a good idea. All they can do is say no, but it's worth it to just, if you're contacting a counselor, to just say, hey, do you offer free phone consultation before we begin? And then here's some questions that would be good for you to ask. These are in line with kind of the last section of what is it that you're looking for. So you want to ask what type of counseling is offered. And so there are different kinds of counseling, right? Some counselors focus a lot on educating you and training you and giving you strategies, and other counselors focus more on like giving you space to process and grieve and think out loud. And They're more exploratory and giving you the space to be a bit more in charge of the process yourself. So we would call that non-directive kind of counseling. And then there's some that's more directive where I'm creating a plan for you and we're following the plan. You might have somebody that's more about skill building. You might have somebody that's more about grieving. And so you want to just ask, tell me about your counseling practice. What kind of counseling do you typically offer to people? And just kind of get a sense of the things that they like to do. Again, you want to ask about cost and insurance, and that's an important factor for everybody. And then what kind of training and experience do you have? So just asking that question allows the counselor to share whatever special certifications or specialities that he or she has. But also, are they licensed in a particular state, and how much time have they been functioning in that licensure state? So they might say something like, I'm licensed in the state of Indiana and I've been doing this for 15 years. So you know they have quite a bit of experience. And then you could ask them, do you have any special certifications or trainings? Is there a certain like type of client that you specifically like to work with? It's a great question to ask counselors, because then you sort of hear what are their areas that they lean into that they really enjoy working with. And then I love to ask the philosophy question if I'm looking for a counselor. What's your philosophy of how people change, of how counseling can be a helpful tool to give someone a movement forward to change in their lives? So what is your philosophy on change? And I'll just tell you what I'm looking for if I'm seeking a counselor, which I have many times. If I'm seeking a counselor, what I'm looking for in an answer to that question is something along the lines of a faith-based approach, that like I believe that people can change and it's possible, and that anybody can change and grow. I think we're wired for change and growth. But I also, I'm a Christian. Therefore, I believe that ultimate change, ultimate growth, ultimate health comes as a person is grafted into the vine of Jesus Christ and enjoying and living into their sanctification process as a believer. Now, I certainly would never push that faith onto a client who did not want that conversation to happen, but that is where I'm coming from, and I'm honest about that whenever I talk with potential new clients. So getting a sense of like, how do people change and grow? People can be motivated in a lot of different ways. People want to usually move towards health and growth. And my job as a counselor is to seek to give you wings to help you do that, strategies and coping skills and movement types of goals to move you in that direction. A couple more questions. What is your area of focus? So this is another thing that you can ask related to, are you more of a grief counselor? Do you do more with anxiety and depression? Do you like to work with personality disorders, things like that? Are you more focused on emotions or thoughts or beliefs? Like, what is your area of focus when you think about the kinds of things that need to shift as we seek to change? And you're going to get all different kinds of answers from different counselors. My favorite answer is somebody who comes from a holistic approach, that they take into account all the areas of our being, our emotions, our minds, our thoughts, our bodies, our spirituality. All of that comes together and it's all important. That's my favorite answer to that question, because any counselor that focuses just on emotions or just on thoughts might miss some of the other things that are happening. And then, of course, if you want to have a counselor who is a Christian, you're going to want to ask the question about including faith practices in the process of counseling. So just make sure that you're asking the question and giving them a chance to describe how they include faith practices if they do consider themselves to be Christian counselors. How do you determine the goals that we're going to work on? So who sets the goals? Who decides, and how do we decide what's going to happen to help us move in a particular direction? And then what do sessions look like? It's just a good thing to ask. Like, when I come to counseling, what is the structure going to be like? Then you're giving your counselor a chance to say, well, I'm going to provide you with some worksheets or some materials and we're going to talk it through. That would be more of an educative type of situation. Or I'm just going to let you talk. Just going to let you talk about whatever you want to. I'm going to guide the discussion slowly. That would be a more non-directive approach. So you just want to get a sense of what kind of counseling they're going to offer. Okay, so here's some things to keep in mind. And I chose to add this in because I just think, as I think about people's expectation of counseling, I think the expectation can become very, very high. People will say things like, well, I'm going to see a counselor. They are professional and they will know instantly how to fix me. They're going to understand what I need in any given moment as soon as we talk. Or I'm going to counseling and it's going to be really scary. It's going to take me a long time, and I don't trust people, so I don't even know what's going to happen. But that counselor, if I don't like them in that first session, then I'm out, right? So sometimes it can feel pretty daunting, both on both sides, from the counselor's perspective, daunting, but it's also daunting to the person receiving counseling. So I want to just give you some things to keep in mind to help temper the expectation and to help ground you as you think about the things that are going to happen in the counseling room. And this is really more for you if you're looking for counseling. I'll back up a little bit in a moment and talk about, well, what if I'm looking for counseling for someone else, like my child or a woman? I'm a pastor and it's a woman in my church and I'm trying to help her find a counselor. Well, how does it work? What are some things to keep in mind there? So I'll make sure and add some of those in just a moment. So if you start working with a counselor and it is not a good fit for you, you do not have to keep going. I know I grew up in a home where the doctor or the counselor or the pastor knew best. They know best, and whatever they say is probably right. You should trust them. Well, we all know what happens when we give that sort of blind trust to somebody. It often does not go well, right? We need to have healthy expectations of other people. So I do encourage you to try to give it at least more than one session if you can, because first impressions sometimes don't go great on both sides, right? So maybe more than one session, but if you kind of get into session 2, session 3, and you're sensing that there's not a deep connection, there's not a good connection with the counselor, you don't seem to jive with each other, it's okay to search for a different counselor. And it is good for you to kind of think about, what are the things that would kind of be deal breakers for me? What are things that would make me go, I don't think I want to see this person anymore? And it probably needs to be more than just socially, we're kind of not on the same page. That maybe that matters, but maybe it doesn't matter a ton. But there are certain things that would lead you to go, I don't think I want to keep seeing this person. I'll give the example that I had somebody who specifically asked their counselor for a certain type of counseling, and the counselor said, yes, I do that, I like that, I'm going to be able to do that for you. And within 2 sessions or so, the counselor was going in a totally different direction from that and was not talking with the client about it, was just doing it without really having a back and forth collaborative conversation about it. And the client didn't like that. They said, I wanted this type of counseling, you're doing that, and that's not what I asked for, and we're not having a conversation about it. So I don't think I want to see you anymore, which makes sense. Any counselor who does something that is unethical, obviously, you probably don't want to keep seeing that counselor. And you may not know all of the rules of what's ethical, but just using common sense, if you sense that, I had somebody one time, a client of mine, who actually said, because I asked this question, do you have previous counseling experiences and what were those like? What was good or bad? So that I can know, are there things that I should or should not be doing based off of your previous experience? And I had one client say to me, my counselor was 20 minutes late to every session we ever had. And we met for 6 months. She was always 20 minutes late. And that was disrespectful. Like, some people don't care about that, but this client was upset by this. And I thought, yes, I want to make sure and be prompt, because that matters to you. I try to be prompt anyway. I don't think I would be 20 minutes late to a session, but certainly not every session. So things like that those types of things could cause something to feel like it's not a good fit anymore. And it's important that you pay attention to that. You don't have to keep seeing a counselor that seems like they're not a good fit. The second thing is that the work that's going to happen is yours to do if you're the client. Yes, the counselor is going to work hard. In fact, if you have a counselor who's not working hard, again, you can fire them. But I think it's really important to remember that that little hour that you're having with your counselor is not going to cause you to grow. It is actually supposed to be a springboard into the week that helps you grow and do work, right? So it's not supposed to be the primary space where you do healing work, or where you do, growth work, or where you talk about forsaking sin, if that's your struggle, or your relational problems. Yes, you're going to do that there, but you can't rely on that to be the thing that brings change long-term in your life. There's going to have to be day-by-day work that you're doing. So whatever work you put into it is what you're going to get out of it. It's just like anything else. So, if we use the workout analogy, it's like if you say, well, I go to the gym, why am I not in shape? And then someone asks you how much you go to the gym, and you say, well, I go once a week. Well, that's probably why you're not in shape, is because once a week at the gym for 30 minutes is not enough to put you into good shape. So, having the consistency of the work that you're doing is really, really helpful and important. So, that also helps you to lower your expectations of the counselor. That counselor is not going to fix you. He or she is not even capable of doing that. So, remember that your counselor is human. That means that if I'm your counselor, I cannot read your mind. So, whatever information you give me is the only information that I have to work with. So, if you choose not to share very much with me, that's up to you. You have the ability to share as little or as much as you want. But if you choose not to share very much with me, I will be operating on limited information, which therefore could affect the plans that we create and the strategies that we integrate into your healing process, your growth process. So we want to recognize that counselors can't read your mind, and we're not going to be able to figure out what you need just based off of your body language or whatever. We're going to have to be able to talk and build trust. So it's important to consider that and to recognize that whatever, once again, what you put into it is a lot of what you'll get out of it as well. Your counselor is also not a substitute for strong relationships. So, this is really, really important when you think about your community and specifically your faith community. I hope and pray that you have a strong community of believers that you walk alongside with, a church that bears your burdens with you. If you don't have that, your counselor will not be able to be that for you. And I have seen over and over again, unfortunately, I work a lot because I work with trauma survivors. I work with a lot of survivors of spiritual trauma in the church. And I work with a lot of folks who will say, I have given up talking to other Christians about my experiences and my pain because they say such horrible things that are unhelpful and unkind and then just put me back in a worse spot. And so you're the only one I'm going to tell because I can see that you will be trustworthy with this information. And I to that reply, I can't be the only person. Now, if I am right now, okay, that's a starting spot. We're going to work towards you building a community where even if it's just a few people, your inner circle of people that know your heart and know your suffering and are coming alongside you and praying for you and uplifting you, and you're doing the same for them, that is something that every person needs. We are never, ever meant to walk this journey alone. So I think there is a comfort for some people feeling like, well, I have a counselor and so I'm good. Your counselor can't be your only means of support. That's too much weight for the counselor to bear. It's also too much for you to bear because you really actually need to spread that out among multiple people that can come alongside you. Okay, let me just before we do Q&A, I do want to just share one more thing about it. What if I'm seeking out counseling for someone else? It's not for myself. How do I do that process? And it's a little different depending on the situation that you're in. So let me just address first and foremost, if you are the parent of a child who needs counseling, that can be really tricky. I highly encourage you to seek out a play therapist or someone who works specifically with children and has good strategies for working with children. Again, if a child who has experienced abuse, you definitely want someone who has experience and understanding of that topic, of how to do that work with a child. One thing to note with children, the work is going to be slower. And with adolescents, the work is going to be slower because trust takes longer to build, momentum takes longer to build. So your expectation, and this, I work with actually have a supervisee who's a play therapist, and she says this a lot in supervision. She'll say, "Oh, I just don't know what to tell parents who are like, it's been 6 weeks. Why is my child not better?" Like they really want that. And it's their love for their kid. They want their kid to be doing better, but it's not realistic. So having a realistic goal for, okay, what is this? How long do we think it's going to take? What kinds of things do we need to be doing at home to help foster that growth in our children? So I think if you're working with somebody who's a counselor who works with kids, you really want to be able to have good communication with that counselor. Ask them, how often do you talk to parents? What all do you share with parents about what's happening in the counseling room with my child? Will you give me some tools and strategies of things that I can do at home? Listen, we love it when parents say that. We want our parents involved in the process with our children who are in counseling. So, yeah, asking those questions and seeking to be involved, but also recognize that the counselor is trying to build a bond with your child. So she or he is hopefully not going to tell you everything that's happening in the counseling room because they're trying to build trust and a bond with the kiddo. But they do need to be telling you enough that you have a sense of the growth that's happening and the work that's being done. So there's a balance there, but it's good to ask questions. It's good to be able to be involved if you're a parent of a child who's going to counseling. But again, if there's history of abuse, trauma, that sort of thing, you definitely want someone who specializes in that, who has some special training and certifications in trauma care, so that you just know that they have a sense of it. They're not coming in blind to like, what am I supposed to do with a child who has experienced something really awful. Pastors who are looking for counseling for the folks in their churches. I love it when pastors call me and say, "Hey, can I just chat with you for 20 minutes to kind of get a sense of your philosophy?" And those same questions that you can ask of your own counselor, if you're a pastor, you could ask those of a counselor in your community to get a sense of what they do, and then formulate a list and build relationships with people in the community that are doing this kind of work, so that when you have somebody in your office who needs it, you're not just pulling up a random list. You know these people, and maybe you personally, if you're the lead pastor, you're not able to put effort and time into that. You might be able to find a volunteer in your church who would love to reach out and build those connections and then introduce you to the counselors in the community, so that you're not necessarily doing all of those meetings, but you're able to meet those people, feel comfortable enough with them to recommend them to the people in your church family. But I will say that people who are grieving, people who've experienced deep loss and trauma, often don't have very much energy to put towards finding help. So gauge where somebody is. I don't think we need to do the work for people, but if you've got someone who's really struggling even just to function daily, if you give them a list of 20 names, they might not call anybody. So recognizing that capacity is lower for some people when they're in suffering, to be able to give them a bit more specific direction of like, hey, maybe try this person, or how can I help you to get connected to this counselor? So it might be wise to be a little more intentional with folks who are in seasons of deep suffering, just because often the grief brain is struggling to even concentrate on, oh my gosh, I didn't eat today. So it's important to recognize that they might need more help, if they're in deep suffering, to just be able to make those connections with good counselors. Okay, Jeff, I don't know what all we have, but I'm eager
Yeah.
for a few questions.
This is great. Yeah, well, thank you. So first of all, and not to reiterate, but all sorts of gold nuggets peppered all throughout that. Thank you so much. First of all, I love your heart for people and for the local church and the community and all the rest, especially as you were talking a little bit about identifying, bringing our Christian worldview. That's very important to us, but also being sensitive to someone who may have experienced some sort of church hurt situation. And so all of this is super helpful. We really value that community aspect. You put a few things to keep in mind, and the pressure that can be put on someone if they're thinking that the counselor is going to fix them in a 1 hour session weekly or whatever that might be. And so there's a couple of mic drop opportunities, including going to the gym more than once a week. Maybe that's me. But
I wasn't calling you out, Jeff, I promise.
Thank you. To really see a difference. And we've got to do the work in between those counseling sessions, and put into practice some of the things, like you used the term springboard. Made me think of also like a guide, like maybe my counselor is a little bit of like a guide to whatever I'm experiencing or struggling with, pointing me to the scriptures and other tools that may be there to help me through whatever I'm going through. The end goal being, and I'm just going to drop a scripture reference as I think of the purpose of the local church, right, is Colossians 1:28, to present everyone complete in Christ. And so you use the word sanctification, which if you live near my neighborhood, you would have experienced this like 2.5, 3 year massive construction project on this road. And it just ended. And I think of that road construction project when I think of sanctification. So pardon the dust, pardon the mess. You're looking at Jeff Dalrymple growing by God's grace, steps forward in sanctification, right, in becoming more and more Christ-like. So that kind of points us towards the goal that we have, and discipleship and counseling is leading towards that. Um, can you give us, here's just a softball question to get started. What's the difference between a counselor and a therapist? Or
Well,
maybe that's a softball.
No, it's no. The reason I'm giggling is because I get that question. The word technically is interchangeable. It didn't used to be. Used to be therapist was more interchangeable with psychologist, but as the field of counseling has grown, which
Mhm.
counselors, if you think about it like tiers, a psychologist has to receive more scientific kind of training than a counselor receives. Counselors are a bit more practical in nature. So it's more applied kinds of things. So psychologists are, I would say, a tier above counselors, but we both have to have at least master's degrees. As the field of counseling has grown, then people have begun to use the term therapist to refer to their counselor. So I don't care if you call me a therapist or a counselor; those words are interchangeable. Now, granted, somebody who's not a licensed counselor, I don't think would call themselves a therapist. I would just say it's probably not. But if you have your master's degree and your license and you've done all of that work, if you want to call yourself a therapist, you're allowed to do that. Even the Texas Code of Ethics tells us we can say we are therapists. So yeah, so this really kind of interchangeable.
Well, and so that leads into the next question. So talking about licensure, which represents something, it represents, I think you said more than 3,000 hours of training and all of the rest. So it means something, but those are all state specific. So you need to know. But generally, I'm sure there's a lot of common themes if you move between states, probably covering a lot of similar material, including related to what ECAP does, understanding what mandatory reporter laws in your states, and all the rest. And so then recognizing that maybe someone has a certification in biblical counseling, maybe they're a lay counselor or a pastoral counselor. They may have varying degrees of training that may be, in part, some of what would it be included in licensure, but not necessarily all of it. And so you did a great job helping us understand the different types there related to licensure. But anything else you'd want to say on just license and this topic?
Yeah, well, I will just say that and I want to be careful because I love the biblical counseling world, and I think it is doing something that licensure work can't do. So I'll just leave it at that. But I think there's something really beautiful there. But I will say that because there are not mandates that are like you could lose your ability to be a counselor if you don't know mandatory reporting laws, if you don't follow, like that's not true for biblical counselors. Whereas for licensed counselors, if I don't report a suspected child abuse case, I'm going to lose my license as soon as somebody finds out about that. So there's a consequence involved. There's teeth behind it, which I think is important, right? So I would love for there to be some teeth behind in the biblical counseling world, right? Too, of just like how do we keep these things strong? How do we keep these expectations strong for everybody? But for licensure, yes, I mean we have a code of ethics that if we don't follow, we could lose our license. So obviously there in Texas, there are potential criminal charges that you could experience if you don't report. Every adult is a mandated reporter, but states are different depending on the state. And so I do want to just say that it's kind of a safety net or like a warm blanket, I think, for clients knowing to be able to know that your counselor has rules they have to follow. And if they don't follow those rules, they can lose their license. You
Yeah.
actually have the ability. Every informed consent for licensed counselors includes information about this is supposed to include information about their state's reporting. So like if I want to complain about my counselor, I can contact the state and do that. I have the ability to set
Mhm.
something in motion if something happens that I think is unethical.
So, could you talk just briefly about some of the other specializations that kind of live under that license category? What
Mm-hmm.
might we find out there in the world in specializations?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I have a specialization in trauma. You really can get specialized in anything, honestly. There's trainings out there if you want to be an anxiety specialist or a depression specialist or even these more general things that a lot of people experience. You can get special training in those things. Grief, some people have special training in grief work. But typically, the deeper kind of certifications are going to have to do with specific areas. So, for example, you can become certified as a emotion focused therapist working with couples. So there's like a very specific type of counseling that requires a certain protocol, and you can go in and learn that so that when you work with counselors, you have that speciality. Um, and so any kind of a methodology of counseling that's specialized will have some sort of certification that goes with us with it. You may have heard of EMDR. That's a very common type of counseling that you cannot do unless you get trained in it. You're not supposed to do it until you get trained in it. Then there are specializations that have to do with certain types of therapy. For example, you can get certified to become an equine therapist, which is someone who uses horses to help a lot of times children, but adults as well, in their counseling process. You can be trained in art therapy. You can be, so these are some specialities. Play therapy is a very specific speciality for children. That a lot of people, if they're going to work with kids, they want to get trained in play therapy because it's a very well documented and examined and researched type of counseling that has been known to be helpful to children. So those are just some examples, but yeah, there are certain, you can get trained in hypnotherapy if you want to. Not a lot of people are doing that. I certainly do not, but I do find it interesting to read about.
That's fascinating. Could you tell us what's trauma and what do ministry leaders need to know about trauma?
Well, that's not a softball. That's a do you have how much time do we have? We have 5 minutes.
Well,
Go.
well, maybe just answer it as briefly as you can, and then
Mhm.
maybe there's more resources out there that we
Sure.
could point people to.
So, at its very basic level, traumatization includes two components. The first is that somebody has experienced something awful, something terrible, life threatening, or threatening to their physical, emotional harm, or emotional well being. And so they've experienced something terrible or a series of something terrible, multiple somethings that have been terrible and awful, and have left them in a place of feeling helpless and potentially like they're going to lose their lives. So you have that. But the second component is that that event or series of event actually has created side effects that are now affecting your ability to function in your day-to-day life. And it usually crosses all different scopes of life. So your spiritual life, your bodily health, your emotions, your thoughts, your relationships, all of that is being affected negatively, impacted negatively because of this horrible thing that has happened. And there are four basic areas that someone who's traumatized will often experience, not all of them to the same degree, but four basic areas. The first is people will have intrusions in their thoughts and emotions. Intrusions are just like thoughts or feelings or memories that suddenly come to the front of your mind and you can't get rid of them and they're distressing. So, intrusions is the first thing. The second thing is avoidance. People will avoid people, memories, places, smells, anything that reminds them of that traumatic experience, they'll avoid. The third thing is changes in mood and thinking. And so often people will begin to think really dark and deep negative thoughts, a lot of times about themselves or God or the world. And they are often very absolutist kinds of thoughts like nobody is safe, everybody's out to get me, all men are pigs, those kinds of big statements. And then the fourth thing is changes in our arousal response, which is kind of that reactivity. So think about it like somebody might have a heightened startle response, like they get shocked or scared more quickly, or somebody comes up behind you and that freaks you out. So that's a startle response. And traumatized folks can become very hypervigilant. They're just waiting for something terrible to happen right around the corner at any given moment. So it affects every area of life naturally. If those things are happening, that's what traumatization is. And I do just want to say that not everyone who experiences a really life threatening event or an awful event becomes traumatized. It's not a one to one. There are lots of people walking around who've experienced terrible things and they're not traumatized. And let me just give a little plug to say that the factor that is most causative for not becoming traumatized is a healthy community and strong support system.
Yeah, I noticed as you were giving the definition of trauma and describing it, you were really putting us in the shoes of the person and what they've experienced. And so I would just challenge the ministry leader who's hearing that and the high degree of empathy that you need. Maybe what that person has gone through may not sound traumatic to you, but it is to them. And that's what we need to be mindful of is
Mhm.
really where people are at. And there's all sorts of things behind that. And so slowing down, taking time to understand, who they are, what their background is, what their spiritual background may be, maturity levels, and all the rest, and really looking to serve them. All right, well, we're almost out of time. So I want to ask one more question before asking, how can folks learn more about you and your ministry? So what if someone's watching this later on, they see the recording, they watch the recording, and they say, you know what, I'm interested in being a counselor. Where do I go to learn more and just to explore this field that you're representing and opening our eyes to, Beth? Where
Well,
would you?
there's a lot of different places you can go based on the type of education that you're looking for. Obviously, there's the university route that's going to send you into a graduate level situation where you're becoming a counselor who you can do this for a living, right? Like you can actually make this your career. I know a lot of people end up starting at a lower level in terms of just the a bar being a little bit lower, right? Like I want to just learn about counseling in general. I don't necessarily want to jump right into grad school. I love the Association of Biblical Counselors. That's an organization that I'm really connected to. They're based in Fort Worth, and they have a training program that you can do for if you want to become a biblical counselor, which would be kind of like you can work as a lay counselor in your church and just learn some skills for being able to come alongside people from a Christian framework. But then there's other organizations too that are doing some really incredible things. And so, I mean, I really am okay with people reaching out to me directly. I have this conversation all the time with folks of like, oh, where should I go? What should I learn? What schools work? What's the difference between seminary and grad school? These are all big questions that people have. And so it's hard to answer it without getting very specific. So that's where it's like communication is great. I'm happy to talk with people about those options.
Good. That's super helpful. Well, be sure to visit Beth's ministry website, Christian Trauma Healing Network, and their website is christiantraumahealingnetwork.org. Beth, tell us about Christian Trauma Healing Network. You've got all sorts of resources, events,
Mhm.
training
Yeah.
resources, and
Actually,
all
so
right.
let me just say that here's CTHN. You also can type in
Well,
cthn.org.
that's
That'll get you there
easier.
as well. Yeah.
That's easier.
So I will say, even the question that you asked about, or what you said about empathy and coming alongside somebody in a church setting, we have a free webinar on our website that's called Ministering to Survivors of Trauma, and it's free. It's an hour. I highly recommend that you go watch that. If you're a ministry leader, it costs you nothing, but what you gain there is just some ideas for how to help your church become a space that is safe for trauma survivors. It's a cultural shift that we're hoping churches take, and it takes time and effort, but it does not have to be this massive explosion of a thing. It can be little by little over time, and so we talk about that in that webinar. We also have some other free resources and webinars on our site, and if you are interested, we actually have a certification. If you have had any kind of counseling training that equals up to two 3-hour courses, or 20 hours in a lay counseling program, you could actually take our certification and become a certified Christian trauma care provider. And that will give you some tools for coming alongside someone one on one and working with them start to finish in the trauma healing process. I say finished, we are not finished till we get home to heaven, but to be able to actually think all the way through from the very beginning into where they're in a space of thriving and growth. So if you're interested in that, just go to our website and you can learn more about that. And then here's me. If you want to follow me, I've got the podcast listed there. Counsel for Life is our podcast if you're interested in learning and listening to great guests that we have, like Jeff, on the show to talk about mental health from a Christian perspective. And so it's really fun. We've got 4 seasons under our belt almost, and so 100 more episodes that you can listen to on various topics related to mental health and the Christian life. And then this is how you can follow me on social media or go to my website. And on my website, there's a contact form if you're interested in reaching out to me specifically. I would love to hear from folks. So feel free to take down that information, and then you can just reach out directly to me if you're interested in either counseling to get connected with a counselor, or if you want to learn more about the other things that I'm doing, or to be able to talk about methods and movement towards becoming a counselor yourself. So that's what I got.
Well, thank you, Beth. I hope you guys will take a moment to go visit their website. Also visit Beth's website. It's bethmariebroom.com, right?
Mhm.
And then be sure wherever you get your podcasts, Apple or Spotify or wherever, go look for Counsel for Life and check out some of their episodes. This has been Beth Broom with the Christian Trauma Healing Network on Meet the Experts. I'm your host, Jeff Dalrymple with the Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. And we are here to provide resources like this to help you prevent and respond to abuse in a Christian ministry context. Of course, ECAP is a national ministry of Christian ministries committed to child and youth protection. We're now in over 20 states in the country and growing. So learn more by checking out some of the free resources on our website, ecap.net. We'd love to help you create a safe place for kids to hear the gospel and to grow in discipleship. Thanks for being with us so much, Beth. Thank you. And to our live audience, have a great day.